So I'm worrying about a low level of enthusiasm among Democratic voters as we're entering this midterm election year. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. If you share my concerns, maybe you could like this video, subscribe to this channel, even click that little bell that will notify you when I post something new. So I can already hear progressive Democratic activists saying, hey, why should we turn out and vote for Democrats when they can't deliver when we elect them? Now, I can sympathize with that argument because, of course, I, too, am frustrated with the situation we're in right now. I'm outraged over the fact that we can't pass the Build Back Better bill or voter rights legislation, and the behavior of the Supreme Court is absolutely galling. There are times I have felt that Joe Biden could be stronger in his advocacy on some of these issues, and I'd like to see Merrick Garland taking a little more aggressive stance on prosecuting Trump and his cronies. Nevertheless, there is one very good piece of information that came out of the recent failure of Democrats to overcome the filibuster to pass voting rights legislation. And that's that, yes, all 50 Republicans in the Senate voted against changing the filibuster, which basically made it impossible for us to do anything. And yes, the Democrats' two problem children, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, voted along with the Republicans, making it impossible for Democrats to move forward with the vote on the legislation. But what's actually more telling is the strong unity among Democrats to actually change the filibuster to allow voting rights legislation to go forward. I mean, what we forget is that 48 out of 50 senators voted in favor of changing the filibuster so that we could go to a vote on the voting rights legislation. Joe Biden, who has positioned himself as a moderate and who, from a policy perspective, has actually shown himself to be a moderate in many cases, has come out in favor of changing the filibuster to be able to allow voting rights legislation to move forward. That's remarkable unity. And in the House, the Democrats stuck together overwhelmingly to pass the voting rights legislation, whether they be moderates or progressives. It didn't matter. We were all on one page there. So the problem is not Democrats. The problem is two Democrats, Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. Now, unfortunately, with West Virginia the way West Virginia is, it's unlikely that Joe Manchin could even get reelected at this point. So we just have to be grateful for the fact that at least there's a Democrat there, so Mitch McConnell is not the majority leader right now, standing in the way of anything that Joe Biden wanted to do, including even appointing his own people to the cabinet and to other positions in the administration. Kyrsten Sinema, on the other hand, represents at best a purple state, and certainly a state that seems to be trending more and more Democratic. And as such, I think there's a good chance that she'll be defeated in the next election, whether it be in the primary by a Democrat or in the general by a Republican. And to that I say, good riddance. The problem is, she's not up for re-election for another 3 years. So where does that leave Democrats? Well, of course, we should be aware of the midterm curse, which basically says that whatever party's in power ends up losing seats in Congress. And given Joe Biden's recent standing, I think there's good reason to be worried about that. However, Democrats should not feel that all is lost at this point. Clearly, what the biggest issues are right now that are depressing Joe Biden's favorability are people's frustration with the economy and with the coronavirus. Now, people might say the economy is booming, and that, in some cases, is part of the problem, actually. And that's that we have high inflation. Well, inflation is not going to last forever. You've got two forces that are going to directly attack it. One is the Fed, that's made it clear that it's going to start raising interest rates to get inflation under control. And they have shown repeatedly that doing so can be highly effective at stopping inflation. Unfortunately, it is probably going to depress the job market a little bit, but given how hot the job market is right now, that's something that we can probably live with. Secondly, inflation is certainly driven by issues with the supply chain. And there, you've got the markets are going to take command. We just heard about how Intel is going to invest $20 billion in a new plant in Ohio to build computer chips. Why are they doing that? Well, the problem is that as we rely on other countries to be parts of our supply chain, when an issue arises with those countries, suddenly the supply chain becomes less reliable than we've come to expect. As a result, businesses are going to step in and try to address this problem because they're basically leaving money on the table by being unable to supply enough goods that Americans are demanding. As a result of that, you're going to see increases in production, and what's more, especially, probably increases in production here in the United States, which is also a good thing. And that will also help bring down inflation. So you've got these two forces on opposite sides basically working to bring down inflation. And to the extent that Joe Biden has any ability to influence inflation, which unfortunately really is limited, he has taken steps directly, for example, by releasing a portion of the strategic oil reserve to bring down oil and gas prices. And his efforts to attack antitrust issues is probably going to also stop the widespread corporate profiteering that we're seeing as a result of this inflation. Granted, those are relatively minor issues, but the truth of the matter is the president has relatively limited control on his ability to control inflation, but unfortunately takes the blame for it. Similarly, on the coronavirus, I think the administration has learned its lesson. They did an amazing job getting the vaccines at the beginning of 2021, but since then their response has been fairly inept. That was especially highlighted around the holidays when Jen Psaki announced that they were not going to help distribute tests to Americans concerned about the Omicron variant. Well, now the White House has reversed course on that, and they're doing their best to get the tests out, as well as the N95 masks that are needed. But beyond that, we actually have better treatments for the coronavirus coming out, as well as increasing immunity to it. I mean, that's kind of the untold story of the Omicron variant, which is, with its highly transmissible nature and its relatively low lethality compared to the Delta variant, it's infected a lot of people and basically allowed them to develop some type of immune response, thus supplementing the 70+% of the country who've already received at least some of the vaccinations. And already we're starting to see the Omicron variant starting to recede. So the hope is that in the relative near future, we're going to see some kind of return to at least some level of normalcy where we're living with COVID rather than essentially allowing it to completely disrupt our lives every time something new emerges. So if those two things settle down, then I think we can expect to see Joe Biden's approval ratings start to rise again. Is it fair that he's being entirely blamed for these things? Not entirely, but it's reality. Research has shown that people largely vote based upon their perceptions of how they're doing. And the fact that they're not feeling good about things means that they punish the party in power, that being the Democrats. So if they start to feel better about things, Democrats are likely to be rewarded. As we saw when Ronald Reagan was reelected by a huge margin. Remember that in 1984, the economy actually wasn't doing all that great, but it was the trajectory that was positive. And as a result of that, people were willing to give Reagan credit and vote for Morning in America, as he put it. So my hope is that we'll start to see some approval in Biden's approval ratings as the year goes by. Then structurally, in the Senate, the Democrats actually have a couple of good opportunities. Ron Johnson is a sitting duck, in my opinion, in Wisconsin. And in Pennsylvania, we have an open seat where quite a cast of characters is running for the Republican nomination. I think the Democrats stand a good chance of winning that seat as well. There are other possible opportunities for Democrats, but I think it's fair to say that those are probably the two best. At the same time, the Republicans are facing an uphill battle to win anything new. Their best opportunity was against Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire, and that has pretty much evaporated now that the governor, Chris Sununu, has decided he's going to run for re-election rather than running against Hassan. Other seats the Republicans hope to take are Georgia, which is held, of course, by Raphael Warnock, the former pastor at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King once preached, where Stacey Abrams is running for governor at the top of the ticket, something that will certainly drive black voter turnout in a big way. And they hope to beat Mark Kelly in Arizona, who's an astronaut, an actual American hero, whose wife is Gabby Giffords, who was shot in the head while she was holding a constituent service town meeting when she was a member of Congress. If the Republicans think those are the best shots to defeat Democrats, well, they've got a tough road to hoe. So the Democrats might actually be in a position that we can pick up a couple seats in the Senate. Something that would be great because, of course, that means that suddenly Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin would become irrelevant. We wouldn't be relying on only them to give us the 50 votes we need to change the filibuster, for example. But to be able to take advantage of that, we need to hold on to the House. And Republican gerrymandering seemed to indicate that even if nothing changed, the Republicans will win the House, right? Well, as it turns out, in a big surprise to most analysts, and myself included, it turns out that the Republicans haven't been able to be aggressive in gerrymandering as they would have liked. Instead of actually increasing the number of seats they have access to in most states, what they've done instead is basically fortify the Republican seats they have, make them safer Republican seats. There are exceptions, of course, to this, most importantly including Texas, North Carolina, and Ohio. But interestingly enough, in Ohio, the state Supreme Court threw out the Republican gerrymandered map, and the odds are the same thing will happen in North Carolina as well. I mean, they did it before. So suddenly, the gerrymandering isn't looking so Republican after all. So what could stand in the way of the Democrats holding on to Congress? Because if they hold on to the House and increase their majority in the Senate by simply 2 votes, perhaps the Pennsylvania and Wisconsin seats that I mentioned, then we'll be in a position to be able to pass the legislation that we wanted to pass this term. The opposition of Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin notwithstanding. Well, the concern is voter enthusiasm. And this is really the problem that we have in midterm elections. It's not so much that people don't support the party in power anymore, as much as the supporters of the party in power get complacent and don't turn out to vote. In fact, research has shown that in 2010, when, as President Obama expressed so eloquently, the Democrats got shellacked, the reason for that was a massive drop in turnout among traditionally Democratic voters from the 2008 election, when President Obama was elected and won his big majorities, from 2008, when the Democrats won their big majorities and when Obama was elected, to 2010, when they had the big shellacking. Similarly, in 2018, the Republicans lost control of the House, largely based upon high turnout among Democrats. So in other words, Democrats' success or failure rides almost entirely upon how enthusiastic Democratic voters are. Are they likely to turn out, in which case Democrats win, or are they unlikely to turn out, in which case Democrats lose? Well, preliminary indications is that Democrats are not very enthusiastic this time around. Polling has already shown that there's a drop in Democratic enthusiasm, and that on the other hand, Republicans, especially those who deny the legitimacy of Joe Biden's win in the last election, are very motivated to vote in the next election. We see even more evidence of that in the results in Virginia, where Terry McAuliffe lost an election that most people expected him to win. Again, everybody loves to talk about, the people switched from being Democratic voters to Republican voters. But the truth of the matter is, it was purely a function of Democratic voters not turning out. They weren't enthusiastic for our candidate. And frankly, it's hard not to blame them. Terry McAuliffe is a pretty unexciting candidate who ran a pretty lackluster campaign to boot. So the big mission that we as Democratic activists have right now is to get out there and convince everybody who's a potential Democratic voter that they need to get out and vote enthusiastically in this midterm election. This might be the best chance that we have to overcome the filibuster and pass some meaningful voter rights legislation and some of the important social and environmental legislation that made up the Build Back Better bill. I think we could see higher taxes on the wealthy and other Democratic dream legislation that we've hoped for. Things like perhaps statehood in D.C., statehood for Puerto Rico, and addressing the partisanship of the Supreme Court. All of that relies upon Democrats enthusiastically turning out in the next election, though. If we don't, all of that is off the table. So it's incumbent upon us activists to get the message out that that's what needs to happen. Well, if you like this video, maybe you could check out this video about my frustrations with Merrick Garland and his unwillingness to move forward with prosecutions against Donald Trump and his cronies. I'll see you there. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.